That's one of the things that makes him very much kind of 1960s kind of rebel, is that in Chinese culture, and particularly in the martial arts community, you can change things, but you always have to claim it's actually what your master taught you. It's very conservative. So the idea is there was a perfect way of doing it, and now we just copy it forever. And Bruce Lee was coming along with this kind of very American progressive idea of like, the past is imperfect and we're just going to keep improving on it, and one step after another. And he also had this very American individualized idea that even Bruce would say to his students, you shouldn't do what I do, you should find your own martial arts.
Matthew Polly, thank you for joining me.
Hey, Zach, thanks for having me on.
Of course. I love your book. I have it right here, Bruce Lee, A Life, so you guys can get the visual. And I read it last summer. I was living abroad with my girlfriend in the Netherlands at the time, and I have a vivid memory of reading Bruce Lee, A Life in the park on a bench surrounded by ducks, and I'm like, this is pretty good right now. I'm reading about a cool guy, just amongst the ducks, and life. This is like a good life. Can't get better than this.
we should do Zach A Life.
Yes, yeah. That would be it. Just different shots of me just reading surrounded by animals.
There you go. It's like a YouTube commentary on a YouTube commentary on a YouTube commentary.
Well, 100%. It'll be like there's so much with YouTube nowadays. Like there's mukbang, there's reading. Like people literally just watch people eat on YouTube. So I'm sure it's possible to build an audience to just watch someone read a page. Like you put the mic so close to the page and then they flip it and you just hear like that. And
That's
people
right.
are like, oh yeah, like that's reading porn. Reading porn right there.
That's right. It's a Bo Burnham special.
Of course. So I wanted to start with another book, or at least part of another book that you wrote called American Shaolin, which I didn't know existed until I started doing research for this conversation. And I thought it would be better to start with some of your experience in martial arts before we jump into Bruce Lee. Yeah. And so I understand in American Shaolin, you dropped out of Princeton. Yep. You spent 2 years studying Kung Fu at the Shaolin Temple in China. So I wanted to know what drew you to Kung Fu? Like what drew you away from the kind of white picket dream Ivy League school thing of like everyone's like, I'm in Princeton, my life's good, and you were like, fuck that, I'm gonna drop out and go study Kung Fu.
Well, clearly I'm slightly deranged, so you always have to start with that premise.
Both of us.
When I was very little, I was one of those skinny, scrawny 11, 12-year-old kids who got bullied in school, and so I had a friend show me the movie Enter the Dragon with Bruce Lee. And at that moment, I decided I wanted to be a martial arts star. Can we pause for just a second?
Yeah, of course. Power of editing.
Yeah. I have this retainer I just put in, so it causes a little lisp. Yeah, so I ended up falling in love with martial arts and training here in the States, and then I asked a professor, where can you get real training? Where can you learn the real Kung Fu? And he ended up saying, he was a Chinese professor, you should go to the Shaolin Temple. And I'd seen it in movies, but I had no idea that it really existed. And so being young and dumb, I hopped on a plane, flew over to China, and went to the Shaolin Temple, where this was the early 90s. There were no other white people. It was just 10,000 Chinese kids studying martial arts 8 hours a day. And I fell in love with the place and stayed for 2 years.
So you weren't planning on dropping out when you left, or did you have that idea in the back of your mind, like this is a very real possibility that I'm going to be here for at least a year, and it ended up being 2 years?
A little part of me thought maybe this was my path and that I would spend my life as a kind of Buddhist Kung Fu monk. I was young. But I ended up staying. The plan was a year, and then at the end of the year, I didn't feel like I'd really understood the place or had gotten good enough. And then at 2 years, I realized if I continued to stay, I'd never come home again. And at that point in China's history, it was a very poor place, and being the only American there was exhausting, and so I felt like it was time to come home.
Did the monks accept you right away? Like were they familiar with this type of situation? You said there weren't a lot of white tourists there, but were there also other white people that wanted to learn kung fu, or was it that aspect of it mostly coming internally from China?
Yeah, the only tourism was internal. So I was the only white person there. So they thought I was pretty strange, and they assumed that I would quit pretty early. And so it was one of those things where they just kind of humored me, and then I just stuck around long enough that it was like a weed. I kind of was just there long enough that eventually I became part of the firmament.
Yeah, I can't imagine making that type of decision at that age when I'm thinking back to when I was 18 and 19 years old in college. I was so kind of wrapped up in baseball. I was wrapped up in becoming a professional baseball player. And then even if I wasn't playing baseball after school, I still wanted to finish my degree and kind of have I had this nervous anxiety of feeling like this was the path and this is the only way to do it. And my parents went to college. All my friends are going to college. Even if I came across something cool, I would just read about it, or I'd watch a movie about it, learn as much as I can. But then, it was back to baseball, back to school. I don't know if I had the capacity at that time to make that sort of completely chain breaking decision where you're just like, this path, I can put this path on hold right now. Maybe this path will never continue, but this is what I want right now. That seems to take a lot of boldness and a lot of willing to dissociate yourself from your friends and professors and other people around you that are all chasing the same thing, especially at Princeton. I've never been to, I've walked on an Ivy League campus, never been to an Ivy League school, but it seems like that prestige and that tradition is something that once people get, they're not really willing to let go of it.
Yeah, that's very insightful. I think, part of the problem is once you get locked onto a track, it's very hard to step off. And I think because I was sort of unhappy with who I was, I felt sort of cowardly, and I wanted to change who I was. And so I felt this urge to do something dramatic. And I think I was young enough to still be kind of romantic. And I don't think it's that different from sort of young men who sign up on a spur of the notice for the army and run off to war. That kind of desire to test yourself, to do something extreme, and to come back a different person.
What war seems a little bit. I mean, obviously it's different, but it seems like if you enlist in the military, there's also this plan where you elevate, you gain status. Maybe you stay for 4 years. Maybe you decide to leave after your first contract is over. But if you leave for China, it seems like, yes, there's the school there, and yes, you're studying Kung Fu, but who else around you has a roadmap for what you're trying to accomplish? If you enlist in the military, maybe your uncle did it, maybe you have friends that are doing it, a recruiting officer is telling you these are all the different plans of what you can specialize in. But when you're just going off like that, it seems much more of a bottomless leap than going into the military.
Yeah, that's true. I think it definitely had the sense of going into the unknown. And also, now that we live in, a Google age where you can pull up a map of the Shaolin Temple and probably get they're probably podcasting out of the Shaolin Temple too. It makes
they're podcasting, eating rice, filming the mukbang, and then reading porn, and then also doing kung fu. They're diversifying their portfolio.
That's right.
Their media portfolio.
That's right. So it did have a sense of going into the unknown, and I think that's what was attractive to me. Was the idea of it being completely uncharted. Maybe more like an Arctic adventurer back in the 19th century. That kind of sense of going off the map
Yeah, no, it's a weird thing to think about because maybe the possibility that the internet brings and YouTube and being able to listen to the experiences of other people, maybe that huge expanse of knowledge actually restricts people's freedom in a sense and restricts their drive because what like you might have searched a YouTube video and saw people fighting at the Shaolin Temple, watched 20 minutes of it and felt, okay, I satisfied that thirst. Now I can move on. I didn't know it was what it was. And for whatever reason, I watched it and now I feel like I don't have to go in that direction anymore. Whereas back in the day, in order for you to quench your thirst for something, you had to actually do it. So maybe, like I wouldn't be able to talk to you right now without this technology in two separate spaces, but also the internet seems like it could satisfy or like make people feel like they're satisfied to a point that's not actually a real satisfaction. It's more like a surface level quenching of something as opposed to actually doing it.
Yeah, I think that's right. Where you get, it's the virtual friendship thing where you don't have the immediacy of the real thing, but also it takes away the unknown. And I think that's one of the big differences now is there's no place on earth really that's unknown. I mean, maybe North Korea, but we've limited the spaces on the map that you can't actually just get a surveillance video and just watch it. And so I do think what was attractive to me about the Shaolin Temple in many ways was it was like walking off into myth, right? It was a mythic place that I actually didn't know if it really still existed. And when I landed there, I would talk to Chinese people. I landed in Beijing and I was like, I want to go to the Shaolin Temple. And people would say, oh, that was destroyed long ago. They didn't know. And I had to it took 4 or 5 days to ask around before someone could tell me which province in China it was located at. So I think that's a huge difference. Now, somebody picks up my book and then they watch some videos and you can actually sign up online for one of the schools and put your deposit down. And so what's going to happen to a certain extent. And that's a distinct difference.
What was the moment that you realized that you were in the shit in the Shaolin Temple? Like you had this image of what you thought it could be before. You said you were inspired. Was it Way of the Dragon that inspired you?
Enter the Dragon, yeah.
Enter the Dragon, excuse me. So you have this pop culture-ish idea in your head of what it may be. Was there a moment where you realized I'm in it now? Like this is not what I thought it was in a good way. It's like I'm really doing this, and like the kind of fantasy of it wore off.
Yeah, I think the moment that occurred for me was I got to the school run by the government next to the temple itself, and there was some guy who was selling paintings to tourists, and I said I want to study the Shaolin Temple, and it was some local peasant, and he said just wait here. And then he went to get these guys in really kind of cheap suits. And they pulled me into this back room that kind of looked like an interrogation room. And they were basically like used car salesmen. They were how much can you afford to pay to train here? So it's like I'm in some third world scam. That was the moment they turned out to be local Communist Party officials who were running the school, and there were real Shaolin monks training and teaching there. But it was this moment where you realize everything that you'd seen in the movies was this complete, fictionalized fantasy.
Hey guys, this is a quick reminder that the 2 best ways you can support the show are by 1, leaving a rating and comment on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. This is like foreplay for the algorithm because it revs it up and makes our show appear higher in searches. And number 2, you can subscribe to AUXORO Premium at auxoro.supercast.com, where for $5 a month you get bonus episodes and more exclusive content. Thank you for however you choose to support the show. I had a moment like that recently in Egypt in regards to negotiation, like just things not having price tags on them. Right. And when you go abroad, like I've spent almost my whole life in New York. I grew up in Long Island, moved to Brooklyn. I'm here right now. And then once I started traveling at 19, 20 years old through baseball or just, picking a ticket on Scott's cheap flights, I realized how much of my budget was open to negotiation. And I was in Egypt and I was just looking for some things in a shop in Dahab. It's a beach town in Egypt, beautiful. And I was in this shop that was selling sandals and some other watches, stuff like that. And I was looking for another store, but I was just in there and I was just talking to the store owner and he said, I'm going to give you some advice. And by the way, I had already paid for probably 20 things before that in previous days, just going around shopping, just taking the first price that anyone said. And he was like, all right, I'm telling you this because you're not shopping here. You just asked me where another place was. So when you go there, I know the guy, and this applies to any Egyptian store owner. Whatever he tells you, say half of that price in EGP. And then if he doesn't go down significantly, he's still like holding strong on that initial price, just say like, oh yeah, I'm going to walk around and come back, be willing to walk away. And 92% of the time, the person's going to be like, no, like fine, like 200 EGP is good, like take it. And then in that moment, I ended up doing something similar to that, went to the store, and then this light turned on inside of me where I'm like, am I the best negotiator on the planet? Like I read the book How to Split the Difference by Chris Voss, who is a hostage negotiator, like bank robberies. And I remember having the thought when I walked out of the store, like, I know what Chris Voss feels like negotiating with terrorists and bank robbers, because I just bought this pair of sandals for half price. Like this is a magical power.
Yes. It's this amazing thing when you come from what I call a fixed price culture like America, where everything is it's settled, and the idea that you would negotiate is rude, to places where everything's up in the air. And I think that's a huge kind of mental break it takes most for Americans, where you go there and the first price they quoted me was 150% higher than the actual price. And you just assume it's a yes or no, like, yes, I'll do it, or no, I won't, instead of what it actually is an invitation to the negotiation dance. And then, in fact, for most store owners, that's half the fun. Coming up with the prices, that's how they spend their day, because it's kind of boring selling stuff. So the fun part is like, getting an American or a tourist in there and like going back and forth, and you can see them start to smile, and, you can turn it into a game. But it feels really uncomfortable. It's like, karaoke the first time you do it.
I still feel super uncomfortable with it, but after a few days, I started to realize, like what you were saying, that this is, if I don't make this fun, then this experience of trying to buy things in Egypt is going to be terrible. So when I walk into the store, just kind of treat this like a back and forth and have fun with it. And if you can't get the guy down, you can't get the guy down, but like at least you're going to have a conversation. As soon as I would get defensive, like it would just end for me. Like I was like, oh, I screwed myself. Like I got mad because this guy was trying to, get me to pay 3 times the price, instead of making a joke and, saying something about what he's wearing and offering something half or something like that, trying to get a better price.
Yeah, exactly. The huge difference is to treat it almost like a performance, right? A game or a performance, and you're smiling and you're like joking, and you both know what you're doing, and so it's not personal. It's like just a game.
Are monks really as peaceful and disciplined as they seem in the movies?
No. What I realized is, you get fed this whole Orientalism kind of idea of this, perfectly peaceful, devout thing. It would be like if they made movies about Western priests or preachers, and they were all like totally devoted to the Bible and did everything Jesus said.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. Like if you read the Bible and then you just assumed everybody who was a priest did exactly what the Bible said, that's the way our version is.
Oh yeah.
So, there are drunken priests, there are happy priests, there are depressed priests or preachers, there are ones who cheat on their wives, etc. And that's the same thing with monks. Like there were were a few devout monks. There were some who were there just because they were from really poor families, and this was a way to like secure a meal. There were some who wanted to be movie stars, and so they had gone to the Shaolin Temple to become experts in kung fu, so they could go to Hong Kong and be the next Jet Li or Bruce Lee. So they had a variety of ambitions. The one thing that was distinguishing about them was during the Cultural Revolution in the 1970s and 80s, the Shaolin Temple had been mostly destroyed and all the monks had been run off. And so it wasn't until the late 1980s that the Shaolin monks started to come back. And so they were all very young. So it was like a generational gap. And so instead of having, very old, middle-aged and young monks, you had mostly 18, 19, 20, 25-year-old Buddhist monks because they were the first generation to return. And so, when you have an environment of young men who are very good at martial arts, you have more testosterone than you would normally associate with a Buddhist monastery.
That's cool though. So when you were there, the monks were all around your age, because you were also around 20 or something at the time.
Yeah. One of the funny things is they would like ask me dating advice.
Really? What would you say?
Well, they assumed because I was American and all the propaganda about America is that we're a decadent, libertine, sexualized culture. So they just assumed that I was very worldly. And I was like, dude, I've had like 2 girlfriends. I can't help you.
Yeah.
But usually that was 2 more than they'd had. So, they'd kind of want to, one of the things, I remember distinctly was one of the monks I liked the most, Monk De Ching. He said to me, he was very handsome and very talented, and one of the local waitresses had developed a crush on him, and I think they'd started like necking or something, and I don't think it'd gone far.
Like
making out, yeah,
like making out. Okay,
yeah, and he was like, "I feel like I'm a bad monk," and I said, well, yeah, but she's so cute. I think even the Buddha himself would make an exception for her. So there was a sense of kind of conflict between their, the ideals of how they were supposed to be, and then just the natural desires of 18, 19-year-old young man. And so a lot of them left the monastery about the age where you get a girlfriend and you get serious, and that was considered perfectly fine, that if you could leave at any point. So there was a lot of monks on the edge trying to decide if they wanted to be celibate their whole lives or, they wanted to, date and have a family.
Is there like a monk Rumspringa where you can just leave and just go live life wherever you want for a few years and then come back and they'll still accept you?
They don't officially have that. Oh, that's hilarious though. There were monks who did go out and got married and had kids, and then it didn't work out, and then ended up coming back. So you could come back after you left. There was no like permanent ban if the first time it didn't work out. So there were some monks with like, they wouldn't admit it, but you would hear rumors, and then you'd realize, oh, they'd been married and had kids and got divorced and ended up back at the monastery. It was also interesting. Interestingly, it was such a poor area, and a lot of the monks performed for tourists, and so for a lot of them, this was their main. This was actually a leap up the economic ladder to be a monk, because they started to go on international tours where they could actually make some real money, and so being a monk had a certain kind of economic status.
When you said, speaking about one of the monks, when he says, "I'm a bad monk," I feel exactly that feeling, but the Catholic version of it, because I went to such a strict Catholic high school and had the, typical Northeast Christian upbringing. And I remember moments where I would just look at myself in the mirror and be like, "You're a bad Christian. Like, how could you, how do you expect to get into heaven, diddling these females? Like, how are you gonna..."
with your impure thoughts.
Yeah, like your impure thoughts, and I'm like, damn, I'm thinking about impure thoughts right now as I'm thinking about females. Like there's no way I'm gonna pass. And then I had this moment. I was a junior in high school, and I thought this like something similar about the pop culture view of monks, but with brothers and priests. Like they're just all good all the time, like celibate. They don't get drunk. They don't do the human things. They don't give in to their desires. And then once I got to Catholic high school, that facade broke down a little bit. And then I was waiting for the bus to take me to baseball practice. And I'm by this turf field on the side of the high school. So there's a bunch of people just walking in and out. And there's this driveway with buses. And you could see whoever's going in back into the school, because it was just a wide open thing. There's no way for you to kind of sneak into that area. And I saw a student wheeling 5 cases of Bud Light, just like 30 racks of Bud Light on like the type of things that you would use to carry your luggage. Like that's how much Bud Light it was. They're just this guy wheeling it in, and it was going up to the brothers' room because people were asking him like, "Where are you going with that beer, son?" And it was going right to the area where all the brothers and priests were living. And in that moment I was like, oh, brothers get fucked up like just like us. Like there's probably like the next shipment probably has cartons of cigarettes and like porno mags and like all this stuff. And it's just, you can't have 30 guys living together and just be good all the time and not give in to the same primal desires that everyone else does.
That's exactly right. Religious institutions are made up of human beings, and as you know from your education, we're born in original sin, right? And so they were in general. I think the people who were monks at the Shaolin Temple were of a better quality than the average, but they had the same failings everyone else did, and the same desires, and they slipped up every once in a while. The difference was they felt guilty about it.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to shed, that Catholic guilt, and I guess there's a form of it in every culture, like something that's gonna hold you back and control you to some extent, and make you question, like when you don't have a clear tie-in to why something is wrong, you can always lean back on your guilt and be like, oh yeah, I was born this way. I have this original sin that some guy bit an apple 4,000 years ago, and now I can't jerk off, and that's why. Everything would have been fine.
Yeah, that's right. If it weren't for the snake, I could be fine.
So to dive into Bruce Lee, I understand from the book that Bruce Lee was a hell of a street fighter before he ever got into martial arts schooling, I guess you'd call it. There's a lot on his upbringing as a street fighter. And you go through a lot of situations in the book where he is putting this on display in front of his peers. And I wanted to ask you if you could talk about Bruce Lee's mentality as a teenager and as someone who was literally like a street fighter, because it's so different than what we view as the typical kid who gets into martial arts, like got bullied. He's like, oh, I'm going to show them. And then he conquers, kind of like the Karate Kid.
Yep.
Like that, it doesn't seem like that's Bruce Lee at all. Could you talk about that time in his life where he was getting into street fighting and getting good at it?
So that's one of the things I found fascinating, because my experience was the kind of Karate Kid experience. I was the skinny, scrawny kid who got knocked around by the cooler, better looking guys. But Bruce was the opposite. He was the good looking, famous, because he was already a movie actor at that point. He was a childhood star. He was kind of the Macaulay Culkin of China. So he's good looking. He was charming. He was outgoing. He was like a kind of gang leader. He had like a whole group of kind of followers who would go around with him. And he got into martial arts just because he wanted to be a better fighter. Like he didn't do it he didn't do it for self-defense. He did it for self-offense. And I think that's there's a type of martial artist like that, and they never get written about because that's not the that's not the mythology of martial arts. The mythology is, they say it's self-defense, but anything that's self-defense can also be self-offense. So Bruce Lee, as like a teenager, was a hellion. He was somebody who would go around and purposely, like, they had a routine, he and a friend of his, where they would bump into somebody on the street and see if they could provoke them. And then if they provoked them, just beat the hell out of them. And so for no reason, they just did it to practice their kung fu. So they would go, like, they'd bump into somebody, they'd be like, hey, you bumped into me. And if the guy got mad, they'd try to provoke him into taking a swing and then knock him out. And he did it so many times, actually, that the police went to his house and told his mother, like, we've gotten all these complaints about your son. If he doesn't knock it off, we're going to throw him in jail. And that's how he ended up going to America. His parents were basically like, look, you're heading to prison. So we're going to send you to America as kind of your reform school. Like, I'm sure you went to Catholic high school, so you knew there were the kids who were like essentially sent there because they were such trouble.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
For sure.
The parents who were like, I don't know what to do. Let's send him to the Catholic school and hopefully the priest can fix him. And Bruce Lee was that kid. He was the kid in the back shooting spitballs, slapping you in the back of the head, aggressive. But, he also was very loyal and very charming. And so he had another side to him. But he was kind of born with this incredible temper. And so he struggled his whole life. And in an interesting way, I think martial arts for him, it wasn't about feeling cowardly and wanting to be able to protect himself like it was for me. For him, martial arts was a way to kind of discipline his anger and find a way to kind of channel it. And I think that's what was important to him. And that whole be water was something he would say to people because he was a fire element. He was like burning inside. He was one of those guys walking around, in a bar, who you see them and they're like looking around thinking, who can I fight tonight? Like that. Like, some guys walk in and they're like, who are the cute girls? And some guys walk into a bar and they're like, who can I punch in the face? And Bruce Lee was.
And then the cute girls come as a byproduct of you punching them in the face. So it's two for one. 2 for 1.
That's first you get the money, then you get the power, then you get the girls. Like,
yeah. I think that's what makes him so much more interesting, though, because when you're watching someone who's a pure spirit and they have that typical arc of I'm getting picked on, my pureness, goodness is clashing with this other person who's totally evil and just a total shithead, which is never how it is in real life. Everyone's so dynamic, obviously, but you almost start to hate the pure kid who's learning martial arts in the movie because you're like, oh, I wish you would smoke a cigarette or just like say something back to the adults. And I think that's part of why I enjoyed reading the book so much, is because I wish I had more of that fire that Bruce Lee had as a kid, because it took me so long to question authority. It took me so long to realize that 95% of adults are just people faking being an adult in front of teenagers. And then as soon as as soon as the kids leave, they turn the adult turns to the other adults and they're just like, do you know how to do that? Like, I don't know anything that's going on right now. Like, I wonder if those kids bought it. Right. And yeah, it's something that I wish I had more of early on in my life. And to go back to Catholic school, watching some of my friends who just completely had zero respect for authority. Like they would treat a teacher telling them to do something like it was one of their friends telling them to do something, and they would, occasionally ask really good questions, but they would get lumped in with the rest of the shitheads, and everything they did was seen as bad. And if you do that all the time, things probably aren't going to end up good for you. But having a spark from that kind of fire early on completely changes the game. And like, luckily I've learned to have some of that later on in my life, but that would have completely changed my childhood if I had the realization that adults are just tall kids, basically, most of them. And there's like a few that figure it out and they do well.
It's a great point, which is when I was studying or doing the research on Bruce Lee, what I realized was if he hadn't been a rebel, he never would have been a star. The thing you see on the film that's so dynamic about him, like you watch his movies and they're not, high quality movies, and the writing's not great and the plotting's not great and it's low production values, but he just pops off the screen. And the reason is because you're seeing a guy who is like fully himself, completely authentic, in the sense that he is somebody who would punch you in the face if you made him mad. And I also thought that was highly entertaining because the image of the, Chinese American model minority myth that we have here is the study math, chess club, perfect grades, grind. And Bruce Lee was the exact opposite, right? He was the kid who was gonna, smoke pot in the back and flip off the teacher and, end up in prison at some point. And so I thought he challenged a kind of basic myth that we have about an entire group of people who are, obviously as diverse as anyone else. But yes, his willingness to challenge authority, I think it's one of those things where you either end up a movie star or you end up in prison. And Bruce Lee's breaks went the right way. But you needed that kind of personality to be the first Chinese American to ever star in a Hollywood movie.
Yeah, and there's what you were referring to with the myth about Asians and kind of that docile, just keep your head down, do whatever you say, do whatever someone else says. I feel like there's also a bit of that with celebrity type figures where you could mess with a celebrity and they're never going to actually do anything to you because they're too famous. And I don't know if you saw that situation with Mike Tyson where he punched the guy in the face on the plane. And some guys just, bothering him, leaning back and just doing. I don't know if you could hear exactly what he's saying, but he's clearly just trying to poke the bear. And then Mike Tyson eventually gets up and punches him in the face. And like you could see the shock on the guy and the people around him, like, holy shit, like a guy who's a trained killer just used his training. And people forget that just because you're a celebrity doesn't mean that you're unpokeable. You're still going to react. And I see some of that crossover too with the Asian myth. Like you can do whatever you want. You have to follow the rules and you're never going to push back. And Bruce Lee definitely went against that.
It would have been interesting if he had lived longer, like how many times he would have, because when he was, on movie sets, stuntmen, it's in the book, the stuntmen would do the same thing. They were like, you're not a real martial artist. You're just a movie star actor. You don't know how to really fight. And on the set of Enter the Dragon, he at least twice said, oh yeah, come down, and got in a fight with one of the stuntmen on set. And I was thinking, could you imagine if Tom Cruise on the set of Top Gun was like, hey, stuntman, why don't you come over here? The insurance company would fly their mind, right? So the idea that in 1972 in Hong Kong, the biggest star in the whole colony was getting into fights, potentially production ending fights with stuntmen is amazing. And so I think what makes him sort of compelling as a person, but also as a film actor, is he carried that kind of intensity and anger and rebelliousness. There's a rebelliousness can go too far, and obviously being respectful has its value, but there is something to the willingness to kind of challenge the way things are. And Bruce Lee was definitely that guy. In any situation, if you told him something, he was like, that doesn't sound right. I want to do it this way.
Yeah. I think Bruce Lee and the rapper DMX would get along if they were both teenagers at the same time. Because I was reading DMX's autobiography after I read Bruce Lee A Life. And he does a lot of things that are similar to Bruce Lee as a teenager, but plus robbing people. He was basically he would walk around with pit bulls as a 9-year-old kid and be looking for fights, beat the shit out of people, and then get creative with how he would rob someone. He would talk about it. he would talk about it in the book where he's just like, yeah, I was getting good at robbing people and I was getting good at fighting, and then it started to get boring. So I was trying to come up with creative ways to do it and set up all these scenarios. And obviously, like, not a good thing to do. Everyone agrees with that, but it makes for definitely an interesting person later on in life if you can get yourself out of that and channel it into something better, like Bruce Lee did with martial arts and film, and then DMX did with rapping.
Exactly. But that's a good distinction, though, to make between the two, which is even though Bruce Lee was a troublemaker, he was still he came from an upper middle class family, so he was going to a good parochial school with brothers teaching him. And getting into fights on the street, but he wasn't an actual criminal in the sense that he wasn't robbing people, he wasn't doing stick up, he wasn't selling drugs. He was obnoxious and got into trouble and definitely fought all the time. But it wasn't he wasn't taking anything from anyone. So
yeah, I wanted to get into one of the fights that you describe in the book, one of the street fights earlier on. And it's a rooftop fight between a guy named Chung and Bruce Lee. And Bruce Lee, just a quick synopsis, Bruce Lee thinks about quitting the first round. He's fighting this other kid on a rooftop, and his corner guy, and I'm saying this is not what you wrote in the book, but his corner guy was like, if you don't finish this fight, you'll basically be a pussy forever. Like, everyone's going to think that you can't quit, because Bruce Lee wanted to quit, and he was like, oh yeah, we should just chalk it up to a draw. It's not going well. And this fight was like, no, you need to finish. And then Bruce Lee ended up kicking the dude's ass, knocking his teeth out, winning the second round, winning the fight. And it seems like, and you allude to this in the book, like that's a moment that completely changes the way that anyone would go about their life. If something like that happened to me, where it was that prototypical beat the tough kid early on, which did not happen for me, but if that happened where I got back up, just completely kicked this person's ass and went on to win the fight, I would walk around differently for 10 plus years. Like that, the after effects with that, like if I had a bad day, I would be like, well, I still kick Bobby's ass in the second round. Did that moment seem as impactful? Was that just as impactful as a moment for Bruce Lee as it seemed?
Yeah, I think it made a big difference, right? I liked the story mostly because Bruce Lee now has this kind of demigod status as like the greatest fighter of all time. He's kind of like, I compare him to like Achilles from, Homer. He's or Mike Tyson is a good example, or Muhammad Ali. These are people that we think about in our minds as like the deadliest human beings on earth. Now, they're not. The probably deadliest human being on earth is some, Aryan Brotherhood hitter in prison at Folsom Prison or Rikers Island, right?
It's like Khabib's third cousin in the mountains in Russia. That was 3 times as good as he was, but never really wanted to fight on TV, and it's just some guy that just kills bears in the mountains and comes out like 3 times a year. That's probably
exactly.
Guy.
So that's the thing, is that that's there was a joke in Russian martial arts, like you're national champion but 10th in Siberia. There's always somebody tougher than you. But regardless, we create these sports like boxing or mixed martial arts or kung fu in order to kind of, within a contained framework, show the world who's the toughest at this particular sport. And so Bruce Lee has this kind of mythic quality. I remember once being on a message board. When I was doing the research, and there was like a 3-page thread with like 5 different guys arguing whether Bruce Lee could beat the Hulk in a fight. And they were very serious about this. And I was like, the Hulk is a fictional character. And also he would win, the Hulk. But I thought it was interesting to show that, like, at one point in time, Bruce Lee was a scared kid too, that he had gotten on a rooftop, kind of talked his way into this challenge match, and the first round hadn't gone well. He had a black eye, and he had kind of got knocked around more than he had knocked the other guy around. And he reacted the way any kind of scared 16-year-old kid would, which was he was like, "Can we stop? Like, let's just call it a draw."
Yeah.
And it was his coach, as you said, who was like, if you call it, if you stop, it's a loss, and you will shame yourself and shame our school. You need to, get your shit together and get out there. And so I do think that made a real impact. Those kind of, those seminal moments kind of form our core memories and definitions of ourself. And so I think for Bruce Lee, he had a moment where he looked into the abyss. And, as you said, one way was being a pussy who quits, and the other way was having courage and getting back in there. And he was rewarded for it. I mean, it could have happened. He came out in that second round and just gotten his face kicked in. So that way he probably would have taken a different lesson from that. So I do think that was part of his sort of journey, but also I think it placed the importance of fighting as a kind of character development. And we don't, we live in an anti-bullying world now, but there is something to young men working out their aggressions in a kind of contained fighting space that doesn't occur much anymore. And probably for the best, but there is something lost without it.
Yeah. What do you think of the current climate with preventing violence between kids and teenagers at all costs? Like, it seems to be like there's no willingness for controlled violence with adults present, where you're in a class, or, if you're a teacher watching two kids fight, but not really fight on the playground, you don't just let it go for a few minutes like you would have 10, 20 years ago. You like immediately step in, and your parents get called in, and they're like, your child is never gonna do anything because they got in a 30-second fight on the playground, and you get prescribed 4 different things because you like fighting like any kid does. Well, what do you think about that change with the way that we approach violence as a culture, approach controlled violence? Like, obviously there's a bunch of different types of violence, but like hand to hand controlled violence of kids and teenagers.
Yeah, I mean, part of me as someone who was bullied, it is happier that we take that more seriously. On the other hand, it is part of the kind of developmental process for young men, and I think we should have better ways to channel it. And I do think the kind of 1970s, like, if you guys want to fight, put the gloves on and get in the ring. Or as you suggested, like when I was growing up, the teachers did the same thing. They waited 30 seconds. Like they were like, those kids don't like each other. This has been coming for a long time. Let them hit each other a couple times. Then we'll separate them, make sure that no one gets really hurt.
One 30-second fight could prevent 5 meetings with parents if you just let them settle it then. And you the fight starts, you place a bet with the other teachers, and then you let it go for 2 minutes, and you're like, all right, it's time to
and actually, in weird ways, there are ways in which a fight brings the two participants closer together. Like, I've seen situations where like the two guys get in a fight and suddenly they're drinking beers afterwards, where, they're like, yeah, I'm sorry, man, And the same way, sometimes when you have an argument with your wife or girlfriend, and you shout and you say things, but somehow you get this out of your system, and it creates a bond. And I also think one of the problems of our culture is, there are other types of violence besides physical, right? There's emotional violence. There's intellectual violence. There's the violence of, shaming people or dunking on them on Twitter and embarrassing them. So we've decided that one type of violence is completely unacceptable in all circumstances. And there's good reasons we have, but by only talking about one thing, it ends up flourishing in different ways. Like, human beings are aggressive, and actually there are times when getting punched in the face is the least violent thing that can happen to you, right? There are things that people have said to me that hurt a lot longer than, the guy who just popped me in the eye. I do think if we had a more fulsome discussion, I think there are certain ways in which, the culture has said, like, you can say any horrible thing you want to somebody, but you can't ever touch them. And in a certain way, that seems to me something worth interrogating.
Yeah, because you need to know that there are people on this planet that will punch you in the face if you say something wrong or you take it to another level. And everyone has that threshold. And I had a couple situations early on in middle school and high school where I'm going back and forth with a friend, one insult, another insult, and then all of a sudden you say something that crosses the line and you get punched. Some guy's on top of you and one of your friends pulls him off, and you learn the lesson that it's not that you should get your ass kicked if you say something. That wasn't what I thought, because I feel like some people think that because you let people fight, you're going to send a message that that's how you're going to solve all your problems. I remember thinking as a 10-year-old kid, like, oh, there's some people and some things that when you say these words in this combination and you pair it with that person, you're going to get hit in the face. So a skill that you need to develop is talking with a stranger and then getting a sense of where their line is so that you don't get punched in the face, and then learning that with your friends too, because everyone is different.
No, I think that's brilliant. And I have a 7-year-old boy, and he goes to a very fancy school where they police that very closely. And so one of my worries is that he will go out into the world and not know that it's dangerous. And exactly that lesson. I do, I have the same reaction sometimes where I'm interacting with somebody and I'm like, this person doesn't know that there is a line, and if you cross it, someone might punch you in the face, right? I'm sure you've had that thing where they're like, you're listening to them, you're like, you don't realize how close you're getting. And so I think that is one of when you intervene too much, certain things don't get learned. And that's one of the things that doesn't get learned, I think, as much today as it did when I was growing up. I'm not sure I needed to learn it as much as I did, but I could have had a fewer lessons in that subject, but it is useful. And I have this, from that background, I instinctively know I can, you can just watch the shoulders tighten, the neck, the head turns, and you're like, okay, it's time to take a step back.
Yeah, it can be a dangerous thing, especially if you're someone that wants to travel a lot. And, I've in no way traveled as much as you for that long of a period of time. But even in my shorter travels, because of conflicts I've had when I was younger and doing some physical training with Muay Thai and some grappling, you get to understand what a person looks like when they're about to attack you and when that line is crossed. So it can be dangerous if you're traveling and you're talking with someone and you have no sense of, this person is about to do something to me. You're just talking oblivious, talking shit. You've never been in a physical altercation, and all of a sudden you get punched or stabbed or something. Like it can be really it could be a really harmful situation if you don't at least have some experience with people getting pissed off at you.
I do actually think every boy should have like one little fist fight when they're in third grade to kind of, also just the sense of what it means to have that kind of adrenaline rush and what it feels like to have your nose hurt like that when you get punched in the nose. And the truth is the human body is not very good at causing damage. Like if you think of,
it's good at taking it.
We're a defensive creature, basically. And when you think of all the other animals in the kingdom, like they have actual weapons built in and we don't. And so what that means is you can have a physical fight, and in most cases, the person comes out just slightly worse for wear. Now that's easier to say now that I'm older and I don't fight as much, but I do think that's I think we over police it now, like a lot of the kind of helicoptering that we do.
So something else that you really get into in the book is this submissive / dominance aspect of Bruce Lee's nature, where if he meets someone that he wants to learn something from.
Yeah.
If he's even jealous in a way where someone has a skill that he wants to acquire, he will consciously submit himself to that person emotionally, like the power dynamic, saying, all right, I will play this role of being the one who's the lower rank while he's acquiring the skill so that he can then dominate the person in that skill that he's trying to acquire. Where does that come from? Because that's such a conscious thing to do. You have to make a choice to do it. Where does that sort of dynamic come from with Bruce Lee acquiring skills in that fashion?
It's an interesting adaptation technique. One thing to realize is Americans are quite weird as far as the rest of the world is concerned, in the sense of like wanting to pretend like we're all equal. Like, it's a very distinctly American thing that, like, in almost every social circumstance, if you're a celebrity, you're supposed to like pretend like, I'm just one of the guys. Like, here's me fixing my car. Right? I got millions of dollars, but I'm at the gas station just like you. Like, that's a very distinctive sort of American thing. And in China, almost every relationship immediately is hierarchical. It's like first brother, second brother, third brother, fourth brother. Like, that's how they name them. Like, that's how they refer to each other. Like, if you're in a group of friends, it's immediately distinguished who's the leader, the Lao Da, and who's number 2 and who's number 3 and who's number 4. It's like we only think of that with like a mafia gang, where they're like, or in like the most restrictive corporation or the military. And so in every situation, if you're kind of Chinese, particularly of that era, you immediately know you're jockeying immediately to see who's higher and who's lower. And so you kind of instinctively sort of slot yourself in. But I think what was interesting about Bruce is that he would, if somebody had one aspect that he wanted, self-consciously go, oh, okay, brother, you're the wise one, you're the smart one. Tell me what to do. But he would only do that until he acquired the skill, and then he would try to reverse it. Yeah. And so the most interesting case was later in life when Steve McQueen, who was the biggest movie star of all time, was one of Bruce's students. And Steve McQueen came up from the streets. He had a hard upbringing. But he and Bruce were kind of jockeying to see who was like big brother. And Bruce at the beginning realized he would have to kind of bend down to Steve McQueen because Steve had everything he wanted. He was a movie star. He had all the money. He had all the girls. He had all the fame. But Bruce was, part of his drive was he wanted to reverse it on Steve and become the bigger star.
Yeah, that's a really good intuitive sense that he had, because even if you're from a society like Bruce Lee was, where it's very power dynamic, like you said, you immediately know where you are when you meet someone on that rank and they make it known, and then you move to America, which is a place where people pretend like it's equal. He was intuitive enough to know that even though America pretends like everyone is equal, our human nature is to play into the roles of I'm going to dominate this or I'm going to submit to this. And when someone is being submitted to, a dominant person likes that. So they'll be more willing to share that skill with you. It's actually in your best interest to become dominant by being submissive and making it a two-way street where you're not just sucking the life out of this person like a martial arts vampire. You're giving them something in return. You're making them feel good. You're telling them stories. Like in the book, you talk about how after Bruce Lee's sessions with Steve McQueen and other actors, he would just sit around and talk philosophy, and they would stay there for a long time and just listen to him talk, and eventually tried smoking weed. And I'm sure that was one of the most epic pot conversations of all time.
Steve McQueen, James Coburn,
just listening to high Bruce Lee. Oh my God, just listening to a high Bruce Lee for 3 hours, just just completely flipping what you
That's right.
thought the
Talking
meaning of
about
life
Lao
was.
Tzu. Yeah.
But it seems like it's just it's a very just intuitive or like I don't know. I feel like you can't. That's one of those things that you can't learn, is to have the sense, not just learning a skill, but having a sense of what the best way is to learn a skill, and then tapping into the human nature of that. It's such a feel, touch and go thing with different people,
Right.
because he's trying to acquire a bunch of different skills, but he's also talking to a bunch of different people, and that
Yeah,
changes for
exactly.
each person.
And so, one of the nice things about doing a long biography is you can see the ways that the trial and error, like he didn't get it right all the time. There was one of his students who accused him of hitting on his wife, and Bruce Lee broke off the relationship. So there were times where Bruce Lee's temper took him down the wrong path, or he made a mistake. But then there were other times where he was, quite clever in the way that he advanced his career. But what's interesting about him is you can see him thinking it through. He just wasn't a hothead. He was also calculating how do I, as a Chinese immigrant, basically coming to America, how do I climb to the top? Who do I have to fuck around here, basically, and he had that kind of like that sense of like, who do I need to talk to? Who do I need to charm? What do I want? And I also just find it fascinating. He was such a young man. He was like 27, 28 when he was trying to figure this out. And to me, the idea that he was like sitting around with Steve McQueen smoking pot as like a 29-year-old is kind of fascinating,
It is. If you didn't tell me how old Bruce Lee was when I was reading this book, and you just laid out the events, and the end of it was, and he died in his sleep when he was 85,
Yeah.
I'd be like, that seems like a long life like that. And then you find out how early he died, and it's fascinating and incredible how much he was able to accomplish in that just such a short period of time, and all the people he was able to
and
to work his
humbling,
way into.
right? It's like 32. I think I was still sorting myself out. So he burnt bright and he lived fast, and I think that's one of the reasons he remains kind of iconic is that he has that kind of the comet that streaks across the sky feel to him.
Did Bruce Lee try to use this power dynamic with his father? Because I know his father was also a famous actor in Hong Kong, and Bruce Lee was obviously acting from such a young age. Did he view his father kind of in a cold, calculated way, like still love him, but in a way where he's thinking, I'm gonna work my way in, just like I would work my way into Steve McQueen and absorb this knowledge? Was there any sort of the dynamic between
I think
Bruce
that's
and
where
his father?
Started. It seems very simplistic, but I think his father is the original kind of Oedipal conflict. I think every son has some aspect of that with his father, and it's particular if you go into the same profession. And so it was fascinating to me. Bruce Lee's big break as an actor came when he was 10 years old. He became the star of this film called My Son Assam, or The Orphan, and his father was in the movie too, but he had the bigger role. And what was even more interesting to me is that his father didn't let Bruce act after that movie, like for 2 or 3 years. And his father, so his father ended up saying it was because Bruce was doing badly in school, but I kind of partly suspect he didn't want his son being a bigger deal than he was. So I think the conflict went both ways, and as a result, I think a lot of Bruce Lee's drive to be the world's biggest star came from the fact that he was trying to one-up his father. But I think his father ended up dying too early to see Bruce's success, so he never had the moment where he was able to be like, who's the big man now? Like, who's the king? Who sits on the Iron Throne? But I think that's what drove him in his mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I imagine that would provide a really good spark to have discipline, but also have that fire in you throughout your life. If you think that your dad is somehow manipulating your success because he doesn't want you to become bigger than he is, even if it's not true, even if you just have a sense of it, like, I would have grown up so much differently. Like the way I interact with people, the way I view success, the way I handle myself emotionally. I imagine that was just a complete 180 in terms of how that relationship with his father affected the way Bruce Lee went about things.
To me, that was a very interesting moment. It wasn't clear his father's control over his son's career, how much of it was for his son's benefit and how much was for the father's ego. And so Bruce must have suspected that as well. And it probably was a little bit of both. And was it 80-20 or 20-80? Who knows? But it wasn't 100% pure concern for his son. And then the other aspect I think that was really powerful for Bruce was that his father became a very serious opium addict. And it was very common in that era for his father was an opera singer and an actor. And it was very common for artists of that era to smoke opium. But I think what happened was, like, it's a very, common story. When Bruce was young, the opium smoking was still under control. So his father was still kind of a powerful figure. But by the time Bruce was a teenager, his father really kind of descended and, started to head towards rock bottom. And so that completely changed a young boy's perception, right? You idolize your parents, you're afraid of them, you're angry with them, but you never see them as pathetic. And I think he started to see his father as pathetic.
Do you think that's why Bruce Lee never really went off the rails with his huge success with drugs or drinking or something like that? Because he saw his father.
I think that's why he was always walking that edge, which was he wanted to maintain control, but I think he might have gone off the rails at a later point. Like, almost every addict's story, if you listen to them, involves a parent who also had that problem. So I think Bruce would have had some problems with drugs later on if he'd continued, but he definitely was afraid of it. And what's interesting is he spoke to his wife, Linda, about how his father wasn't there for him and about his father's addiction. And so it clearly was a subject of emotional pain for him.
One of the things that Bruce Lee channeled his energy into was being an absolute ladies' man. Like in the book, he seems like an absolute savage, knows how to dance. He knows martial arts. He was very enthusiastic. He had all the charisma in the world. Can you talk about that aspect of his life? Because I feel like that doesn't get brought up a lot, that Bruce Lee was just he was the epitome of what pickup artists try to be. Like, just swoop in, do a dance move, knock some dude out, and then walk out of a bar with your girl and be like, all right, see you later.
Yeah, that's he liked the ladies, and that's sort of one of the things that was fascinating about him. Again, because the model myth minority stereotype is that the Chinese guy is good at math, but he's not good at picking up girls, right? And so Bruce was very interested in, he was a charmer. He was incredibly handsome. He was a dancer as well. He was a cha-cha champion from, when that was the sport, that was the dance of that time. And he was a tough guy fighter too. So there was a kind of frisson of violence that he carried with him. And I really do. I think it's fascinating that he came here and he slept with a lot of really beautiful, amazing women. And one of the stories I uncovered in the biography that hadn't been told before was he and Steve McQueen were in a kind of love triangle with the same woman, and that she was with Bruce first, and then she did her next movie with Steve, and then she was with Steve, and then she was with Bruce, and it was like high school. It was like some kind of like where the cheerleaders dating the captain of the basketball and the football team, and so Bruce Lee was he had a kind of sexual charisma that's unique amongst Chinese actors, certainly of that era, but even to today.
That is amazing. If I was in a love triangle, that's like being in a love triangle with someone like Brad Pitt today. Like if I was pissed off about a girl I was dating because she went to go see Brad Pitt instead, and there was this back and forth, I might be angry for 30 seconds and be like, damn, she went to go see Brad Pitt. And then I'd be like, she went to go see Brad Pitt. Like
Yep.
I am Brad Pitt's
All right.
competition.
In this one situation, yeah.
when girls are yeah, in this one situation, like I when she's not thinking of me, she's thinking of Brad Pitt, and that's pretty cool.
And that's sort of what he said to her. He's like, I get it. He's a bigger star than me. So, you know, so yeah, that's the I thought it was interesting that in researching Bruce's life, that Hollywood of that era did feel like one big high school, and that they were all just running around making out with each other and sleeping in various things and hanging out and getting into fights and, you know, trying to see who was the coolest. It was high school with a lot more money, basically.
Yeah, that seems like it would be the best time to be in Hollywood, like that Steve McQueen era, the Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, before all the cell phones and before TMZ, paparazzi following you everywhere. You could legitimately hang out at people's houses, go from party to party, have love triangles. Like it wouldn't be the front page on every tabloid if you held someone's hand like it is today. It's like, oh my God, is Ben Affleck dating this person? You know, they ordered the same thing at a sandwich shop 15 minutes apart. They must be trying to hide something. And back in that day, it seems like that was really the golden age of living the glamorous life of a Hollywood
I think you're
star.
right. That's where you could have your own privacy, and you only had to deal with people like through the Johnny Carson show, right? You know, it was much more protected.
Yeah, I like that. I like the separation. I think there should be separation between me and Brad Pitt. Like I shouldn't know everything that's happening in Brad Pitt's life, nor do I want to. And it's like in order for him to be the person he's going to be, he should be separated from normal people. And I don't mean better or worse. I just mean like he's completely transcended the idea of being a celebrity into this superstardom thing that we aren't good at conceptualizing as human beings. That person should be separate. Like there should be separate spaces for someone like Brad Pitt or Margot Robbie to walk in, party, have a good time, no one's there, and just leave. And that separation is respected. Whereas now it's impossible to get away from, and you're expected to just say what you had for lunch on social media or TikTok Live, something like that. Like I enjoy the separation. I hope we get back to a little bit of that with the pendulum, because it seems like it's just completely swung in the full transparency back from and it used to be zero transparency. I feel like the best is somewhere in the middle.
It's almost social media is almost too democratized, and it takes away the mystery, and that's part of the charm, right? That you only got to see them through their movies instead of 100 different shows, etc. So yeah, I agree with you. We made it a little too they're too familiar.
Yeah, I only want it to be my channel on YouTube for reading porn. I don't want Brad Pitt to be competing with me. I just want. I'll be fully transparent, and then I don't need him.
We should only learn about them when they have really ugly divorce trials. That's about like the Johnny Depp.
Exactly. Oh my God, Jesus. What are your thoughts on the pieces of that trial that you've seen between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard? Have you gotten to really sit down and watch?
No, I've been trying to avoid it, to be honest. So I can't speak about it with any authority except to say it strikes me as one of those things where both sides should have been talked out of it. Like no one's going to end this with their career in a better place, either Amber or Johnny Depp. And so whatever it is that kept them from finding some sort of solution before going on a public trial, that was a terrible mistake. It's great theater for us, like we're watching a car wreck, but the details, the SNL sketch about it, I'm like, oh my God, like this, who was Johnny Depp's representative that he didn't like They didn't just say, what does she want? How much can I pay her to make this go away?
Oh yeah. And it's a very healthy thing that you're skipping it. I feel
Mm.
like I'm watching a car wreck, like you said. It's like you watch 5 minutes of it and then you can't look away and you keep watching and then you slow down and you're thinking, oh my God, did this actually happen? Can I trust anything that anyone
Yeah.
is saying? Because they're both actors. And when you're bawling your eyes out on the stand, how many times have you done that before? What is
Right.
real emotion? What's not real emotion? So the whole thing is just, you got to take a page out of the old Hollywood book and settle your divorce as two incredibly bitter
right.
people behind closed doors, and
right.
then come
With
out
the,
and
studio
act like everything's
executive,
okay.
that Samuel Goldwyn sitting there going like, this is the terms of the agreement. Now go off and do what you're told.
I mean, things are so sick now that I wouldn't be surprised if people are watching the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial and someone at Netflix is like, should we start a live stream divorce? Should we just, like, celebrity couples won't agree to this, but should we exploit poor middle class people in America that are getting divorced, that are already draining all of their finances from the divorce, and we say, we'll pay for your divorce if you participate in this reality TV show.
That's a good pitch.
It's crazy.
You could definitely sell that one.
Yeah. Well, if you're listening to this and it sounds like a good idea,
put your email in the show notes.
We'll talk. Send me a DM. Yeah. I'm a terrible person for a price. So there was one moment with Bruce Lee being a ladies' man that I did want to bring up, and it was incredible because I wish I had the resources to do something like this. He took a girl out to a date at a movie, and he was starring in the movie unbeknownst to the girl, one of the stars in The Orphan. And then, I imagine the dialogue was something like where, kind of bullshitting before previews are on, and then Bruce Lee's on the screen and she's looking at Bruce Lee and then looking at the screen and is like, and he's just like, yeah, that's me. It's like, it's whatever. That's the ultimate dating power move. I don't think that I've ever heard of a better power move that's been documented in a date, just to like let the other girl know your status. Like, yeah, I'm in movies. It's fine. It's whatever. Don't look at me. Watch the movie, or look at me on the screen.
Yeah, exactly.
Either one is fun.
It's funny you picked up on that. So that date became his wife, Linda Lee. Yeah. So
yes, that's right.
He had just come over to America. He was like 20 years old, 20, maybe 21, 22. And she was 18, and they were hanging out as kind of a group of friends. She was a student in his martial arts school, one of the first ones he started. He was the teacher. And yeah, they went down to Chinatown to watch a movie. And what's so funny is because he was famous in Hong Kong, no one had any idea over here. So yeah, they walked into the theater and sat down, and he kind of, casually was like, yeah, I'm also an actor. Right. She understates it, but I'm sure it blew her mind, right? That not only was he her kung fu teacher, but he was also a famous actor who she was seeing on screen. So you're right. As power moves, as pickup artist moves go, being able to take a date and unbeknownst to her, reveal that you also happen to be a famous movie actor would be a clincher for a move, right?
Yeah, a martial artist of pickup as well, for sure. So in the book, you write that Linda Lee, or marrying Linda Lee, ended up being the best decision that Bruce Lee made in his life. What made that true? Why was it such not just a great decision, but the absolute best thing that Bruce Lee could have done?
He was a young man who was immature in certain ways, and he needed someone to kind of chill him out, for one. So she was a very calm person, and because they had kids really early, I think it gave him a purpose in life, and a focus that he wouldn't have had he was a childhood star. And as we know from all childhood stars, they almost never end well. And I think the two things saved him. One, he was a childhood star in Hong Kong, so that didn't mean anything over in America. So he got here and he was a nobody again, and that recalibrated him. And then when he married Linda, I think he had a kind of purpose in life, which is he had a wife and kids to look after and pay for. And so that kept him. I'm sure there are a number of situations where he refrained from, beating the shit out of somebody and ending up in prison simply because he was like, I got a kid.
Yeah.
He was that guy. He was like, oh no, I can't beat up this producer. I need this job. And I think, also she was a good balance for him. Because she was in many ways very kind of worshipful of Bruce and subservient to him. But she stood up to him when it really mattered. Like there's this one of the stories I really like was he hurt his back and so he couldn't teach. And he couldn't act. And so he was out of work. And I think all of us can sympathize with what it feels like to, go through periods where there's no income. And, he told her, you can't get a job because, I'm a proud Chinese man and I can't have my wife working in that era. And she basically was like, F off. Like, I'll do what you tell me most of the time, but our children need to eat. And so I'm going to get a job. And the funniest thing to me was he went through this whole routine of trying to come up with like, what would be the excuse? Like, if someone comes by, what do we tell them, that you're out shopping? So he was so like, it's such a different era, right? The idea that you would be pretending that your wife has a job so that you wouldn't be humiliated. I thought that was very distinct in their relationship. And so there were moments where she would step up, but in general, she knew how to kind of calm him down, but also build him up.
Yeah, it seems like that would be such an important aspect of staying in a healthy relationship with someone like Bruce Lee. Because if you were constantly subservient, everyone is, not everyone, but a lot of people are like that to him because he's a master in martial arts and he's also getting into Hollywood films. So there are people that are yes men and yes women all around him. And I've never tasted anything even close to that level, but I imagine it's good at first, and then it gets very boring for people to tell you yes all the time. And then if someone occasionally is like, no, fuck off, that probably makes you go,
what is this emotion I'm feeling?
That's interesting.
Is this rejection? I don't know what that feels like.
Yeah, what is this? Is kind of fun. Yeah, what is this?
I don't know what is this. Who says that to me? Yeah. I think that's right, which is she stood up when it mattered. And so he could rely on her when he was way off base to be there. But he would not have done well with a very feisty wife, like someone who was like, no, you do. Like he was definitely of that, like, I'm the man. You do what you're told generation. And so it was interesting to read about that because, one of the things that happens in all the kind of movie betrayals of Bruce is we try to modernize it to our sensibilities. You probably haven't seen, but there's the 1993 movie Dragon, the Bruce Lee story. No, but it's not a great movie.
No, I haven't.
But in it, one of the things you immediately as a parent is they've made Linda Lee, his wife, into basically, the 21st century woman. She's like feisty and sassy and she doesn't take any smack. And like, it's a very funny, if you know the real situation, it's very funny how obviously they've like tried to make, sex positive, like third wave feminist character out of like somebody from 1950s who was like, the Mad Men era. So that's a huge change.
What did Bruce Lee do? What was he like when he encountered someone that was not like his wife, but someone that was an early feminist? Are there any documented conversations or encounters that Bruce Lee had with strong independent women?
So his first girlfriend actually in college was that Amy Sambo. And she was kind of a proto-feminist of that era. She wanted to be an artist. She did jazz. Like, she went to college. She was very independent. And basically, they just fought like cats and dogs. And, he was always trying to get her to be like, a good submissive Asian wife, whatever his image of that was. And she was always extremely angry with him for expecting that of her. So, it was one of those like breaking up and getting back together and one of those torturous relationships. So, like we often do when we're young, we date the person who would be terrible to me. You got to get that out of your system, right? You date the bad boy or the crazy girl or whatever, and eventually you find what's right for you. And a strong, independent woman was not the right thing for Bruce Lee.
Yeah, it's a good question, and something that comes up a lot in pop culture is can two strong, driven, just like A-type personality people succeed in a relationship, or is one eventually gonna have to submit to the other? And I think back to the scene in Whiplash where the Miles Teller character, main character who's a drummer, he has this conversation with his girlfriend in a diner, and he's laying out to her methodically why the relationship isn't going to work, because he's always going to put drumming above her, and he's going to do all these things and travel and practice for hours a day. And he's kind of presenting it like you would present in a PowerPoint to someone at like a high school presentation. And at the end of it, she's just like, "You're such a piece of shit. Like, what is wrong with you?" And then just walks out. And then, the movie doesn't really revisit that relationship in a meaningful way, but it's a question worth answering or worth thinking about that doesn't have a definite answer, but that dominant submissive relationship, can you have two people? Can you have the female Bruce Lee dating
they can have a great
Bruce
affair
Lee?
like they can have an amazing affair, but
yes.
I do think that there has to be some sort of, you're trying to balance the other person, you're trying to look for some sort of balance, and two type A's tend not to work. I'm sure there's 7 billion people on the planet, so there has to be exceptions, but I think that's why you almost always see like an introverted, like either the wife's the talker or the husband is, and the other one's quiet. Like extrovert, introverts almost always pair up together. And you usually see one who's the more ambitious and more driven, and the one who's more sort of nesting, build the home up kind of thing. I think the problem was in the old days, we just always assumed it had to be the man who was the extroverted go-getter, and the wife had to be the like introverted, take care of the home. And that's of course ridiculous. But I do think you need the balance, and so it tends to be one or the other.
Yeah. Now it goes both ways. The spark for me buying the book Bruce Lee Alive was actually the podcast that Quentin Tarantino recorded on the Joe Rogan Experience. Yeah, so something that always stuck with me is the way that Quentin Tarantino describes the relationship that Bruce Lee had with the stuntman. And Tarantino said, quote, "Bruce Lee had nothing but disrespect for American stuntmen." And I'm taking that out of context. It's probably a 25 minute segment just on Bruce Lee, but that was one of the things that he said. Is that true? Did Bruce Lee have disrespect, nothing but disrespect for American stuntmen?
And I tweeted this out, so it's public, but I said that was a misrepresentation, because he claimed that was from my book. And I've actually talked on the phone with Quentin Tarantino about Bruce. So I think what happened is in his movie, he did a representation of Bruce that was a little less than charitable, shall we say, a bit of a caricature. And Bruce's daughter, Shannon Lee, criticized him, and then he took a lot of flack for it. And so he's feeling a little defensive. And so I think feeling defensive, he kind of overstated his case, which was when Bruce Lee came in, he did not like the way American stuntmen did stunts. And if you watch the first 1967 version of Star Trek, you could see like Captain Kirk throw a punch and he misses by like a mile. Like it's so clear they're not hitting each other. It's like almost a joke. And so Bruce Lee looked at that compared to what they were doing in Hong Kong, and he was like, "This is silly. You need to get close. It needs to look real." And the stuntmen of that era were like 40-year-old cowboy types who were like, "Why should we change? This is great for us. Like no one gets hit. You know, we've done this for 20 years. Who was this little Chinese guy to come in and tell us we should do something different? You know, in one way you can say, is it disrespectful if you come in and you have a better idea than the people who are doing something? I mean, I guess in a way you could say that. Bruce Lee came in and he thought, the way you're doing this isn't as good. I want to do something better. And today we all agree with Bruce. Like, Bruce Lee's stunt choreography is how all stunt choreography is done. It looks like his movies. It doesn't look like what, you know, the John Wayne 1960s Western thing where you throw that big wide punch and you miss by a mile. So in that sense, it's one of those perspective things. Like Tarantino's saying, for Bruce to come in and want to change things was disrespectful. And my perspective is, you know, Bruce Lee came in and saw something was flawed and he made it better. Exactly.
Yeah, more like a clashing
It's not
of
about
ideologies.
respect. It's about like two different ways of doing something and people arguing what's better. And Bruce Lee's ideas won out. But Tarantino's film was about that era when that was all changing. And his main character was a guy from the previous era. And that's why his sympathies are with, you know, the Brad Pitt character.
Yeah, he's the way that Bruce Lee would go about stunts, and I'm just speaking from watching a lot of video footage in his backyard and teaching people around Hollywood, but also having students, like the black and white footage of him punching and kicking people just in a half an inch away from their face. It's incredible how close he was able to get to make it look like he was roundhouse kicking someone in the jaw. And then when you look at it, you watch the description of the video and it says, this is Bruce Lee showing a stuntman how to kick someone in the face. And I'm watching some of these for the first time and I think, oh, like this, like he actually is kicking him in the face. So I imagine when you're showing American stuntmen a way to do something that looks better, it is better on screen. And you talk a lot about that in the book of how Bruce Lee was very aware of what is effective in martial arts and what is going to look the best on screen, what's going to be the most entertaining. When you're having that conversation with stuntmen who don't think like you, but you have the same goal in mind of, we need this to be as entertaining as possible. We need people to think these people are actually getting hit when they watch the movie. That's going to cause some tension. And I agree with you. It's not a disrespectful thing. It's more of, I see what you're doing. This is how I do it. This is my way of thinking. And I've evaluated both and my way is better. So here's how
and you can imagine at that time, you know, he's like 26 or 27. He's Chinese. He's got an accent. He's about 5'6" and 130 pounds. And you've got like these 6'3", you know, 250-pound white guys who've been doing stunts in Hollywood for the last 25 years. And they're like, who are you? Shut up. Go away. This is how we do things, kid. Like, you go back to China. Well, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
It's just that Bruce Lee proved right. Like, the way Bruce Lee said we should do it is how we do it now. And the way they used to do it is not how we do it anymore. Bruce Lee's ideas were better. But obviously at the time, it's perfectly fair to say stuntmen of that era were not happy on the set of The Green Hornet with Bruce Lee. They weren't. They thought he was annoying. And he would do these little stunts. He would do these little stunts, and every once in a while he'd kind of pop one of them, and they'd get pissed off, and they would be like, "What the fuck," you know? And Bruce Lee was like, "These lazy, fat Americans don't want to like work hard, you know? Back where I come from, we kick people in the face, and we get back up and we do things, and they're complaining because I accidentally hit one of them a little bit." So I think there was a cultural clash, 100%. And Bruce Lee didn't have the status then that he has now, and so that's where the conflict was. But that's why I think where Tarantino gets it wrong is he's picked a side in the argument. He sympathizes with the white stuntmen of that era, and so he sees Bruce from their point of view, as like, you know, a kind of arrogant, cocky little shit. And so his movie portrays Bruce in that way, and that's what people reacted to. We were like, why are you portraying Bruce Lee as a cocky shit?
Yeah, that's Brad Pitt was more Bruce Lee than Bruce Lee was in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, because Brad Pitt followed the playbook of, okay, this cocky little shit wants to fight me.
Funny,
I'm going to submit to him for the first round. They did the best out of three. I'm gonna just see what this dude does. He'll punch me, knock me back. We're not gonna punch each other in the face. Like whatever he's gonna do, I'll be able to take it. So Brad Pitt saw what he did, and then Bruce Lee does the same thing the second time, and Brad Pitt throws him through a car, basically, and that is. If you are staying strict to the ethos of Bruce Lee on screen, that Brad Pitt's character follows that more closely than the caricature of Bruce Lee that Tarantino chose to go with. At the same time, like I'm trying to remember if I read the book first and then watched the movie. I can't remember which order it was in, but I remember feeling a little bit agitated because I knew at least the legend of Bruce Lee, that he was a very, a great martial artist. He was very philosophical, seemed like a guy that would be the winner in this engagement with Brad Pitt. And then I was a little bit kind of pissed off when I saw the scene at first. And then I remembered that the movie is called Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's literally a story. It's a reimagination, Tarantino's reimagination of what may have happened had things gone differently. Yeah, like the Manson murders, other things that happened in history. Yeah, the Manson murders. Like what would happen if Brad Pitt had a shotgun in his house and blew the Manson family's head off and then chopped them to pieces by the pool with Leonardo DiCaprio and just roasted them like marshmallows with the flamethrower, which is one of my favorite scenes of all time. And
that's right. So slightly different.
Yeah, it's a little bit. Yeah, because it's slightly different.
A little bit different than the actual history.
Yeah. So to me, it's I watched that scene now with Bruce Lee, and obviously knowing so much more with the book, and I know it's just a different imagination of who this character was.
Yeah, I agreed, and of course he's a filmmaker. He can do whatever he wants, and he's one of the greatest filmmakers in American history, and one of my favorites. So what happened was because I'd written the biography, the news media called me up and was like, "Is this accurate?" And I was like, no, I mean, he doesn't have to be accurate, but it wasn't very accurate. I think he could have portrayed Bruce Lee as being arrogant like he did in that scene, but to portray him as kind of a blowhard, who runs his mouth, provokes a fight, and then gets beaten up, it was like one step too far.
Yeah.
Like Bruce, Tarantino did read my book before he made that movie. And so he was basing some of it in things he read in the book, but he was taking it for his own purposes. And from my perspective and in my research, Bruce Lee was not as pure, obviously, and innocent as some of the portrayals that the family gets into, as we've talked about in this broadcast. But he wasn't, in my experience, the kind of guy who he didn't provoke fights with stuntmen on set and then lose them. If he got in a fight on the set, he would have won. That's the thing.
So the only way...
He wouldn't have fought some guy and got his ass beat. Yeah.
So the only way to settle this now is you have to call Tarantino back and challenge him to a fight, and whoever wins gets to rewrite that scene. And they put it into the movie as an alternate scene.
Yeah. No, I mean, Tarantino's 100 times better writer and director than I am, but I would totally kick his ass. I'm not too worried about Quentin Tarantino in a fight, but he is everything else. He's better than me at, but not that.
What was the conversation like on the phone? Was he calling you about the movie? Was he just interested in Bruce Lee after reading the book?
Oh, well, he had read the social media post where I said he was wrong, and I think he was responding to that. And what I thought what was interesting is he's actually a really sensitive artist, and so it bothered him that people were upset with him about the Bruce Lee portrayal. And so it's the kind of thing was, he was like, I know this isn't exactly what happened, but is it possible it could have happened that way? So he was kind of looking for a kind of defense. And to be fair, because of some of the criticism, his movie got banned in China, which cost the studio a lot of money.
Really?
Yeah. So it was. I mean, it's not. What's interesting is it's not like some Twitter feud. It's not like he said something and then somebody else, Bruce Lee's daughter said something and then it went away. It meant that his movie did not appear in China, which probably cost the studio 50, 80, $100 million. So had real consequences.
Yeah, that's a big chunk of change.
Yeah. And that I think is totally ridiculous. Like, how he portrayed Bruce Lee has no effect on, like, it should have been shown in China and everywhere else. It's, it's a great, I actually really enjoyed the movie. I thought it was one of his best.
Yeah. I loved it as well.
Just that 1 3 minute scene with Bruce Lee kind of made me unhappy. But other than that, I thought it was brilliant. So
I give, Tarantino is fucking fantastic, obviously. And I give him credit for sticking to his creative guns with the Bruce Lee scene. And knowing, he spoke earlier in the podcast about refusing to change a certain scene about another movie. I forget which one he was talking about, but he was talking about having a conversation with Harvey Weinstein, I believe it was. And he was like, yeah, we need to change this, and he was like, fuck that, I'm not changing it. I'll go with someone else. And then Harvey Weinstein was like, remember who let you do this movie the way you wanted to. And then having $100 million from China on the table, if you just changed 3 minutes of the movie, and to say F you to that, it's crazy, but I also respect the hell out of that.
Yeah. He's a genius, right? He's one of the 2 or 3 greatest filmmakers of the last 30 years. Pulp Fiction is my favorite movie of all time. So he's an absolute genius. But geniuses sometimes do things that we criticize. That doesn't make them any less brilliant or admirable. I think Tarantino is one of the great gifts to American culture. But I think he was wrong about those 3 minutes of portraying Bruce Lee, and he could have done it differently. But that's a very minor criticism across an amazing career.
Is there a criticism of Bruce Lee that you find yourself revisiting, whether it's in the book or thinking about Bruce Lee as a person after having published the book, like something that you latch on to within his genius that you view as something criticizable?
You're gonna have to rephrase that. You mean like something that I would regret that I put in the book? Or...
No, yeah. Let me rephrase it. In a similar way to which we both agree that a genius like Tarantino gets criticized. There are things that people view as worth criticizing within that genius. It doesn't take away from the genius. Right. Is there something like that for you with Bruce Lee?
Right. In the book, something that if I had it all to do over again, I might adjust.
No, just more. Not an adjustment in the book, but something that stands out to you about Bruce Lee, whether it was in the book or not, that you view that you would criticize or that you might change.
Oh yeah. Ton
you
of
would
things.
do differently.
Yeah. There are a ton of things about Bruce that, like if he were my friend, I would be like, yo, Bruce. One of the things was he just spent money like water. He was a humongous spendthrift. And it's because he was raised with money. So he never thought about how to save it. And he had this period where he was first married. Their second child was coming. They bought a house in Brentwood they couldn't afford. And his acting career was going nowhere. And then he just ran out and bought a Porsche 911 to be like Steve McQueen. And they couldn't afford the mortgage on their house. And I'm thinking, Bruce, you can be a kind of chauvinist from that era who thinks that the man should be in charge of the house, but you can't do that if you can't pay the mortgage, right? That was that's the one obligation of, you can believe in patriarchy, but the patriarch can't fail.
Yeah. Right? You gotta have, you gotta have the dough to fund the patriarchy.
That's exactly right. Like you have, if you are going to be in charge of everything, you have to be able to, you can't blow it on like Porsches. You have to be able to keep the house and your wife secure and your kids. So I thought he had failed on his own terms, right? I think it's very important not to criticize somebody from our point of view from 50 years later. I find that really tiresome where we go back in history and, write people out because they don't live up to our supposed enlightened standards of morality. Morality changes over time and it tends to pendulum back and forth on certain subjects. I wanted, when I wrote the book, to be very careful not to impose 21st century morality on Bruce Lee. But I do think you can criticize him for where he failed in his own sense of what was right and wrong. And so I think that was one of them. I think there were several times where he let his ego get in the way of a friendship, and and I, and that because he thought of himself as a very loyal person, and I think occasionally he let pride and ego get in the way of things. Those are the sort of areas I would criticize. Also, you may not know this, but recently some letters came out showing that Bruce Lee had something of a cocaine habit.
Really?
Yeah, they were just auctioned off about a couple months ago after my book came out. And so that doesn't really change my perspective on Bruce because I always sort of viewed him as kind of an actor who was trying to be like Steve McQueen. But it's a little more extreme than just smoking some pot and eating a few hash brownies.
Was it letters written by Bruce, or was it about Bruce Lee and using drugs, or what was the perspective?
No, it was letters written by Bruce to his drug dealer in California asking him to ship more cocaine over.
Wow. That's such a romantic way to ask for drugs. I think if you are going to do drugs, you should have to write a letter to your drug dealer saying how much I appreciate you and how much I want to do the drugs, and I really enjoy the service that you're providing to me. Like, spice it up a little bit instead of just sending a text. Your guy comes to the door, you don't know anything about his life. Like I'm just imagining Bruce Lee going back and forth with his coke dealer with love letters, like following up every month, just being like, "How are you? You know, I haven't heard from you in a while. You know, I've just been thinking about you."
It's like. It could be like Civil War letters, like "Dear Sir, the war goes on. When will it ever end? Could you send some more coke?"
Yes.
So his dealer was one of his students actually, so it was somebody he knew.
Yeah.
So there's like a series of at least a dozen letters back and forth where he's like, one of them is like he wrote a letter where he said, "I'm so high." And the letter's slanted, like he's writing like a 6-year-old, like big cursive, and so the thing what struck me about it is that's not a text or an email. Like, you wrote the letter, and then the next day you had to mail it. You can't. I think he had a lot of the kind of celebrity flaws of that era. Which don't look as good in retrospect, but were very common back then. And I think one of the things you think about is if he had continued to live, would he have ended up in rehab? Like, would he have been like 4 divorces later? Would he have been making Enter the Dragon 6? As a desperate attempt to reinvigorate his career. Like, one of the things about dying at the peak of your powers is that's how you're remembered. And no one sees you get old. No one sees you mess up. And all the things that happen to people is, Brad Pitt's amazing, but we've all seen him go through like Angelina Jolie accusing him of being a drunk who hit her kids. Like, Bruce Lee never had to experience any of that.
Yeah, and we've had decades since then to build up the stigma against drug users and apply a moral lens to it through the lens of 2022. But at the time, cocaine was a relatively new drug. He's around all these celebrities that are also doing it. Like, I'm trying to, put myself in the small slice of what I do know about Bruce Lee's life, and being someone who's open-minded but also not afraid at the same time, and also very philosophical. I could totally see him just seeing cocaine, acknowledging that, yes, this seems like it is a bad thing for a lot of people to get into, but at its core, it's an experience. I can ingest this substance and have it run through my body, and I'm going to have thoughts and feelings that I wouldn't have sober. Just like smoking weed. Like, obviously, cocaine's a much more addictive, intense drug, but I imagine him kind of trying to philosophize the cocaine experience and doing it for the first time. And, I don't know if he was doing it every day or he did it like 5 or 6 times. I have no idea of the frequency, but I could totally see it. I could see him approaching it with such an open, inquisitive mind, and just approaching it like any anything else. Like, this is an experience I'm having right now. All my friends are doing it. It gives me energy. You know, this feeds into exactly what I want to do. I want to talk to people. I want to do kung fu. Like, seeing Bruce Lee coked out doing kung fu must have been like the top level of energy that anyone has ever had who's existed.
Yeah, actually, like it feels like you could have like nuclear fission out of that. Like it's that much energy in one place. Yes, I think you captured it quite well, which is he was a man of that era when during that era people did not think cocaine was very dangerous, and it was very popular and people did it, and now we know. And so that's why the letters were hidden for so long, because they didn't want to hurt his reputation. But, Martin Scorsese in the early 70s, who had a huge cocaine habit, like that's just Hollywood at that time.
Yeah.
Steve McQueen did. They just thought it was something that you did. And so Bruce did the same thing. And in fact, one of his letters, he says, I'm working on this screenplay. I need some more good ideas. Send me more coke.
Yeah.
So he was like, that coked up writer, like trying to get all his ideas, and he's all full of energy and all the stereotypes that we now find kind of embarrassing. They were forming it back then. So I don't think much differently of him because of it, but it was surprising. And it's interesting, like how a reputation gets formed. He's seen as almost like a monk-like figure.
Yeah.
And he turns out to be much more human and interesting in real life.
Yeah. Taking a page out of Stephen King's playbook, doing the coked up writing sessions.
Zach, I need to use the restroom.
Yes.
And then probably wrap up fairly soon because I have another thing. But
yes, I'll
use. Right?
Yes, of course. I'll use the restroom with you. Not with you, but at the same time.
No, please. That would be the best podcast ever.
Yes. I'll see you momentarily. What is your hard cutoff to?
I need to be done by 1:30.
1:30. Okay, I'll wrap up a few minutes before then. Is that okay?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
yeah.
I'll be right back.
I wanted to give you a way to kind of arc into your end.
Perfect. See you in a sec. Okay, so I think a good topic to get into as we end off is the follow the master mentality of Eastern philosophy and Eastern martial arts versus what Bruce Lee was bringing to the West, and his innovative skill set and his willingness to go against the master, which from what I understand from the book was not common at all back then. It was very offensive to a lot of people in the martial arts community. Can you talk about exactly how disruptive that was for Bruce Lee to be going around and recruiting students and saying my way is better, I'm creating my own form of martial art, I'm taking what works from everything else, and basically spitting in the face of a lot of other masters and not being afraid to talk down to people who normally would not get spoken down to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that makes him very much kind of 1960s kind of rebel, is that he, in Chinese culture, and particularly in the martial arts community, you can change things, but you always have to claim it's actually what your master taught you. It's very conservative. So the idea is there was a perfect way of doing it, and now we just copy it forever. And Bruce Lee was coming along with this kind of very American progressive idea of like, the past is imperfect and we're just going to keep improving on it, and one step after another. And he also had this very American individualized idea that you shouldn't do, even Bruce would say to his students, you shouldn't do what I do. You should find your own martial arts. And I think that's interesting because, we think about that with other arts, like, when you're a writer, they say you have to find your own voice. They don't say, go out and write exactly like Shakespeare did. But in martial arts, that's what they're saying. Like 500 years ago, they did this in the Shaolin Temple. So that's why we do it exactly like today. And so Bruce was in many ways kind of updating the martial arts as a kind of Western art where each individual needs to find their own voice, their own style. And that obviously made the traditional masters incredibly furious. Like they were like, that's not
Yeah.
how we do things. We do what our master taught us, and then you do what I teach you, and then your students do what you teach them in an unbroken lineage.
Yeah.
Now, of course, it was never unbroken. People were always changing stuff over time, but they never outwardly said they were doing that. They never said, I changed this kick because my master was an idiot. They said, this is what my master taught me to do. And so Bruce Lee was the first one to come along and be like, yeah, no, that punch is dumb. We're just not going to do that one. And that's because I know better. And so when he got back to Hong Kong, the Wing Chun students he grew up with hated him and talked badly about him in the press. So he made a lot of enemies.
Yeah. It reminds me of my days playing baseball in high school and college, where the one thing that, I mean, there were a lot of things that we didn't get encouraged to do, but one of the things, the main things that I wish was more a part of the game of baseball when I was playing, which is changing now, it's becoming a much bigger part of the sport, is encouraging athletes to be more creative with how they pursue their skill set, and not saying that this is the way that you throw a baseball 95 miles an hour. This is the way you hit a baseball 400 feet. And we used to do this whole thing when I was younger, all the way up through high school, college, where we would pitch by numbers, and we would get in every position and we'd go 1, you put your foot down, 2, you lift your leg up, 3, you stretch and your foot lands, and just like all the way through the release. And it would be this very robotic, mechanical approach to doing something where you need to be fluid and aggressive, kind of like that controlled violence we were talking about. And later in my career, I had this moment where there was a coach on my team at Richmond, University of Richmond, down in Virginia, where I played. And he had recently been a grounds crew member. There was a changeover of the coaching staff, and he knew a bit about baseball. His name was Charlie, Coach Goins, we called him. And then he got onto the coaching staff from taking care of the field to, oh yeah, do you want to coach here? And my whole life, I had never really been told to throw the ball hard. Like, as counter and as stupid as that sounds, like no coach was ever like, how do you want to throw hard? Like, just let it go. Whatever you feel like you need to do right now, just do it. And one day I'm throwing in the bullpen, and Coach Goins goes like, why are you moving so slow down the mound? And I was like, I don't know. That's, I've always done it like that. I was very like slow with my leg kick, and then would only get explosive at the end. And he was like, if you had to throw a ball 95 miles an hour, how would you do that? Like, probably not what you're doing right now. And I was like, oh, like you're right. And he's like, all right, how would you do it? So I just crow hopped the shit out of the ball, did a jumping throw, essentially a shuffle jump throw, threw the ball really hard, bounced off the top of the cage and went into the lake. And he was like, that's better. Like, channel that into your pitching. And then over the next year, I gained over 10 miles an hour in velocity, which is a very long-winded way to say that I really dig the style of how Bruce Lee shared what he did with the world, because of that encouragement of, don't just follow what I'm saying blindly, but add your own input to it. How would you, once you learn the tradition, how are you going to put your own spin on it? Literally. Yeah.
I mean, one of my favorite sayings of his, one of his most famous, is adapt what is useful, reject what is useless, add what is specifically your own. And I think that's wise for all circumstances, which is, you don't start from zero. You start with the tradition, you learn the tradition, and then you decide which parts of the tradition you keep and which parts you create your own, or which parts you add from something else. That's that like joke about modern art where they're like, you put a dot in the center of the page and that's your painting. You need to learn how to do perspective and, paint apples and then paint human bodies. And then you create your own. In the same way with writing or with baseball, you need to learn the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps. But at some point, you need to figure out how it is you want to throw the baseball. Yeah. And I think that's what Bruce Lee was advising for the martial arts. But it's because martial arts are an art like anything else, and a sport, and a form of entertainment, and a form of spirituality. His kind of advice has resonances for all sorts of fields.
When it comes to you as a writer, is there an example that stands out of how you learn the tradition, but then went against it in some way, and you did things your own way despite what people did before you, or people were telling you like you have to write like this, you have to do this, or it's not going to work?
Not specifically, but I definitely had. There's a part of me that tries to parody what other people do, and then do something different. I mean, one of the things I definitely did different in this book than the Bruce Lee book was I used the footnotes as kind of my DVD extras, and what I wanted to do was make the actual book more streamlined, because the first draft, it was like 1,000 pages long. And so what I wanted to do was you could read the book and feel like you were in the movie, and it had this nice rhythm and pace. But if you came to a point where you were like, I don't know if I agree with that, you could go to the footnotes and get essentially a 3-page like academic breakdown of what actually happened in his fight in Oakland against Wong Jack Man. And so, most footnotes are usually just the reference and nothing else. But I wanted to have a kind of DVD extra area for the really hardcore Bruce Lee fans who are into every little argument about every detail of his life, but allow the book itself to also be accessible to the general reader. So that was something slightly different, and it took not very many books do that, and it took me until maybe the third or fourth draft where I was like, okay, this is how I solved the problem of, I had two audiences. I had, someone like you who knows a little bit about Bruce Lee, and then I had a much smaller group, but much louder group of like hardcore Bruce Lee fans who have read everything as well and want to, they love to get on social media and tell you you're stupid and you don't know as much as they do. So you need to be able to like satisfy both.
Yeah, and having a style of footnotes like that, I'm sure does a lot to answer questions, because if it's someone like me where I have the mythology of Bruce Lee in my mind before reading the book, but I don't actually know a ton about his life, I can go visit the footnotes,
right,
which I did throughout reading the book, and then you can kind of pick and choose where you're going to flip back, where you're going to go. And then someone that is a hardcore Bruce Lee fan reading the book, they can visit that first before hitting you up on Twitter or something like that. Or if someone does have a question, you can just point them exactly to where it is in the footnotes.
Yep. Yeah. So that was slightly different, but it's a great question. And I do actually, as a writer, I tend to be on more of a traditionalist.
What do you think Bruce Lee would be like on Twitter if he was alive today? Because people share quotes all the time, but that's not Bruce Lee on Twitter. That's just things Bruce Lee has said. What do you think he would be like as a personality on Twitter?
Well, the first question is, has he gotten over his cocaine use?
Yeah. You'd have to make an entirely different account for that. Coked out Bruce Lee versus just Bruce Lee.
Exactly. Assuming, and I think he would have done it for a couple years and then realized it was causing problems and stopped. But he would have been hyperactive. He would have been a great Twitter person. I also think he would have been like Oprah Winfrey's best friend.
Yeah.
I think they would have loved each other. She would have had him on all the time, and he would have written some kind of self-helpy kind of Zen book that she would have loved and promoted, because he was like, cool and funny and different. So I think he would have been like a great kind of cultural celebrity as well as being a movie star. Like he would have been the guy that would have gone on the shows and done little martial arts performances and then told jokes that were off color. And Twitter is perfect for him because he had a kind of aphoristic style. Like he liked short, punchy, kind of epigrammatic sayings, and that would fit into 180 characters. And also he had a temper too. So he would have got into some epic Twitter battles with, you could just see him and Jackie Chan going back and forth on Twitter about like, who's the real bitch,
That would have been amazing.
It would have been amazing. Or, Steven Seagal. Could you imagine him and Steven Seagal going back and forth on Twitter? So I think he definitely would have been, all over social media. He just had so much energy that it was always popping out of him, and he very much loved being in the public eye. So Twitter was built for Bruce Lee. It's a shame he didn't stick around long enough for it.
I just finished watching the Comedy Store documentary on Showtime, and it's if you're not familiar with the Comedy Store, people listening, it's the club out in LA, arguably the most iconic place to perform stand-up comedy. And I'm watching the Comedy Store documentary and also knowing that this conversation with you is coming up, and I'm thinking that the culture of comedians, like this counterculture, like fuck you, I'm going to tell jokes about whatever I want, and not following the typical career path would have fit in so well with Bruce Lee's style and the way that Bruce Lee carried himself. I could totally seeing him, because the Comedy Store opened in 1973, Bruce Lee died in 1972. It was. Yeah. I could see him him totally just like hanging out with comedians and getting along with them super well. And I was thinking about, damn, like I really wish he was around today for this podcast boom to hang out with stand-ups on podcasts that have that like that philosophical but trolly attitude where they're not afraid to say shit and just run their mouths. Like that would have been absolutely incredible.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, Joe Rogan would just sit and lap at the foot of Bruce Lee.
That would be 10 hours of podcasting in one episode.
Oh my god! And, I mean, when they broke out the pot too, right?
Yes.
So they would be smoking pot, talking stuff, and Joe Rogan would be just lavishing praise on the master Bruce Lee. So
as we end off, the last thing I wanted to ask you is, how does one live an interesting life? Because you've done so much interesting shit. You've studied Kung Fu with monks. You've trained MMA, which we brushed upon, but you wrote in another book that talks about your MMA training. You've studied Bruce Lee, who's also a fascinating guy. If one is feeling like they're stuck in a boring rut, how does one make their life more interesting and make a life worth retelling?
I'm not sure that's a good thing to do. Like, I have done it. I'm not sure I advise it for everyone, but I do think that there is, if you really feel trapped, there is a tremendous value in stepping off the ladder and running off and doing something kind of crazy. And you usually take a short-term hit from it, but I think the long-term gains are worth it in many cases. So, but it has to be something you're genuinely passionate about. Like, running off and like seeing Australia is nice, but that you probably shouldn't lose your job over that. So if you're really going to go do something, it should be something that you're really, really crazy passionate about. And the one thing I would suggest is, if you're really into something, you should go where people are really good at it. Like, if you want to be a writer, go to New York or LA. Don't hang around your hometown of bumblefuck USA. Like, if you're gonna be a kung fu star, go to Shaolin Temple. Like, go where the great people are and hang out there long enough that you can get in and go do it. And that's, despite our technology, it actually matters to be in the place where that thing is happening.
Yeah, surround yourself with people that are also doing cool shit that you want to do.
Yep, exactly.
Thank you so much for hopping on the podcast. This conversation has been an absolute blast. Again, go pick up Bruce Lee, A Life. This is an incredible read. I enjoyed reading it, whether or not I was surrounded by ducks or I was in the presence of just sitting in my quiet apartment. But really, like, I was not a fan of Bruce Lee before the book. I knew his legend. I knew the myth about him, and I read the book, tore through it. Gonna reread it soon. And it's just like knowing the stuff, not just knowing the stuff about him, but the way you presented it makes it so satisfying to digest. So I hope I did your story and Bruce Lee's story some bit of justice on the podcast. And thank you again for coming on the show.
It was great, Zach. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you, brother.
All right. So I'm going to, that was awesome. Again, thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, good. Thank you.
I know you got to go.
Also, first I do want to apologize. I have like some dental work that's emergency dental work that's going to happen. And so that's why I had my hand in front of my face the whole time. So I hope that didn't throw you off.
No, not at all. I'm actually, I look into my camera, so it kind of looks like I'm looking at you for the remote podcast. So it's
good.
Thankfully I did not have to look at your face during the podcast, is what I'm saying.
I wish I had that option.